and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Chinese and U.S. officials concluded their talks on Saturday in Anchorage, Alaska. The two-day dialogue marked the first high-level face-to-face meeting between the two countries since Biden took office. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said despite the differences, there are places where interests of the two nations overlap. China acknowledged as much, commending the meeting as timely, useful, and fostering mutual understanding between the world's two largest economies. So can China and the U.S. turn a corner after the Alaska meeting? Is it too optimistic a conclusion that we could reach for now? For insights, I talked to Susan Thornton, former acting assistant secretary of state for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. She is currently a senior fellow and research scholar at the Paul-Tsai China Center at Yale University Law School. Through 30 years of experience with the U.S. State Department, she was involved in trade tensions between China and the U.S. during a rapidly changing international environment. Let's hear her insights. Wonderful that you shared your thoughts at the CDF during the weekend. Now I want to build upon what you said earlier then about China-U.S. relations. The talks 3 rounds ended up, it seems that there are quite some deliverables. To you, what are the most important among all of them?
Well, I think the fact that the meeting happened and that they had several rounds of private talks is the most important thing, because we've really got to get back to the habit of communicating it between diplomats and talk through all of the issues that we have between the U.S. and China. I think they came away from the meeting noting that we have overlapping interests in a number of areas and some tough issues to work out, but that's as it always has been. And so I think noting the areas of cooperation or overlapping interests at least gives us a kind of a way forward to have more meetings among people who work on those issues to try to talk substance and get things done, make some progress on some issues. So the issues they mentioned were, for example, climate change. And I know that John Kerry, our climate change envoy and former Secretary of State when I was at the State Department, is going to be meeting, I think it's this week, with his counterpart in China, Xie Zhenhua, at the climate summit that's being convened, I think, by China and including Europe and other countries. And so I think that's a good start. Of course, then in April, we'll have the climate summit in Washington, which will continue that. But there are other issues, communication between consulates and embassies, discussions about visas, issues with regional hotspots that we can work on. And I hope that we can do this despite the difficult atmosphere.
It seems that there are quite some diplomacy shuffling over the past few days, and it's still going on. With the U.S. side, quite busy with the allies, for example, going to NATO meeting, going to the EU summit, and the Chinese side inviting the Russian foreign minister coming to China. So, and of course, an exchange of remarks and greetings between the Chinese president and the DPRK leader. All of these are interesting development. So are these on the surface gestures, or are these meaning the real fundamental changes that we're seeing between China and the United States?
I think that there's an awful lot of public posturing going on, which is, I think, quite natural for this kind of dramatic sort of change in the political environment in the United States. Of course, under President Trump, a lot of allies felt bruised and neglected, maybe not reassured. So certainly the Biden administration has said it needs to repair all those relationships, and it's setting about doing that. But I think the public signaling is a lot of what we're seeing, and countries are trying to show that, they have friends that they don't really, take to heart, signaling from other sides. And so it's a lot in the public domain that is getting exaggerated, I think, and hyped up. And I think sometimes for diplomats, at least for me, it's not necessarily conducive to progress in those behind the closed door conversations.
Of course, we saw that during the 3 rounds of conversations. The first round, fiery debates in front of the camera. I wish they could come to my show, by the way, to do that. That would be a big boosting to the program.
Boost your ratings.
Yes. Or the public TV in the U.S., that would be nice too. But anyway, in the closed door meetings, they did discuss a lot. But many wonder, with the first session, whether the United States, with this administration, is just chose to have a different angle of being antagonistic against China compared to the early administration, rather than changing the nature of the relationship compared to the early administration. Susan.
Yeah, I think it's too early to make these kinds of judgments, to be honest. I think the Biden administration is dealing with a complicated mix of challenges right now. Certainly, they still don't really have their government in place yet. They have a lot of nominees that need to get into their positions. They have a lot of domestic challenges, and COVID-19 is priority number 1, 2, and 3 right now in the United States. And so, between these, factors, and then also the political environment is quite difficult, and it gives a very narrow space for maneuver on a lot of issues, not just China. You see how the Biden administration is, kind of walking a very fine line on things like Iran, on issues like Afghanistan, and can we withdraw by May 1st? There are a lot of issues where they probably have a preference, but they feel that they are hemmed in a bit by the opposition. And so I think that we see that also in the case of China. And I think that the Biden team needs to feel that out a little bit more, think about a strategy for how to get done what they think they need to get done within that environment, and see what space they have there. It's going to take some time with the approach to China, but I think that the first meeting was a good start for at least restoring some communication channels.
And how do you see near term the relationship is going? Of course, as you said, being empathetic about where U.S. is today politically. As you may know, Premier Zhou Enlai said decades ago, action speaks louder than words. That's also what the Chinese want to see. So how is the possibility of preliminary level even of trust between the Biden administration and the current government in China? Susan, how do you see that?
Yeah, one of the things that makes me a little bit worried is there seems to be a bit of a standoff going on where China believes that the Biden administration has to take some actions first to show its intentions to change the relationship for the better. And the Biden administration seems to be looking at China and thinking that China needs to make some moves, some concessions to show that it wants to move forward with the Biden administration, and to give the Biden administration a little bit of political space, because it's coming off of the Trump years, which have very much sort of hemmed it in. This is really unfortunate and pretty tricky, I think, especially because the trust level between the U.S. and China has deteriorated so badly in the wake of the COVID-19, mutual recriminations, and all of that. So I think it will be tough to have just sort of a flurry of mutual actions that could really turn the relationship around quickly. I don't think that's going to happen. But I hope we can. One of the things we need to be able to do is lower the profile of interactions so that we don't have to do everything in front of the cameras, because that is only going to spur hardening of positions. And I know for you, Tianwei, that's not what you want to hear, because of course it should be in front of the cameras. But no, we have to do diplomacy in private. That's how you make progress.
One of the things that has been mentioned in the first round is a very interesting phrase from the U.S. side. Secretary Blinken mentioned from the point of strength, and of course Director Yang Jiechi pretty much debated against that, whether the U.S. has the quote-unquote strength in Chinese eyes. But that is an ultimate question, I guess, both sides have to answer in a way. Of course, international politics is about playing hardballs, but at the same time, what is the meaning of strength?
Well, I think, the U.S., I know that China sees the U.S. position in the Asia-Pacific as having been one of the traditional hegemon. I don't think the U.S. thinks of itself that way, but if it does, it certainly thinks of itself as this kind of benign hegemon, sort of providing security for everybody, providing an environment in which people can prosper, that kind of thing. But in the case of the Biden administration's continually talking about, working with allies to come from a position of strength. I mean, the U.S. is feeling a bit, I think, not at full strength right now. And so that's why they say, we need to build back our strength. I thought the best comment I've heard in a long time from Chinese officials about all this is, the U.S. needs to do its things well at home, and China needs to take care of itself at home. And if we both do our own domestic governance well, that will help a lot with the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China. And I think that's right. It's a matter of kind of prioritization, not seeing everything that the other one does as some kind of a threatening gesture toward yourself, but really kind of turning it around and working on yourself first. There's a lot of psychological and communication issues going on in the relationship right now, which is just making things more difficult.
It is making things very difficult, especially with COVID-19. People could hardly travel, talk to each other often, face to face. How do you see the growing understanding of each other over the past few years? Are you worried, or are you encouraged by the current trend?
I don't think that understanding of each other has been really improving very much. It has a lot to do with the over-politicization of the relationship and the sort of caricature media narratives. I think we do need to do some work on media narratives, need to do some work on educating the public more about, not just about China, but about, how complicated diplomacy is with other countries, never mind China. I mean, there are a lot of challenges out there in the world, and we need to have a national strategy that can prioritize dealing with these challenges. And I think, once we can sort of have a more deep conversation with people to show them that everything is a balance, everything has to be sort of worked out in kind of compromises, and they may not come out in the ideal form, but there are things we can live with and we can coexist. And I think people who say that China represents an existential threat to the United States, I mean, I've just not heard a decent explanation of that.
Yeah, willing to put yourself out there to do this debate, because I saw you, just as you said, some of those making the claims and reaching conclusions without much evidence-based arguments. I just wonder how, as a woman, as a former diplomat, you have this courage. Now, I'm not saying you're doing things for China's interests or for U.S. interests. I'm just saying, personally, this is to me quite an amazing thing.
Well, I don't feel that it's that amazing, Tianwei, but thank you. I think for me, the most important thing that I think about, I mean, I have 3 children. They're in their 20s. I think about what kind of future are they going to inherit if the U.S.-China relationship really goes into a tailspin. And it's not a world that I think anyone really wants to see or have their children have to live in. So this for me is, it's really important that we not let, Larry Summers was talking at the China Development Forum. I don't know if you saw his talk, but And he painted a pretty dire picture of where we may be headed. And, it's our responsibility to head that off. And we can do that, and we
Yeah.
must do that. So that's sort of where I come from. And, I think that people are smart and they're reasonable. At the end of the day, they will see this, but they're not being exposed to much discussion in that vein right now. And I hope if I keep talking that sooner or later someone will listen.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, China is pioneering green finance through pilot zones. How important is it in China's approach of dealing with the climate crisis?
The financial system should not be an obstacle for greening the economy.
This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The world is moving toward a net zero future, but amid a declaration of intent, how can countries bridge the investment gap to reach carbon neutrality? Green finance is poised to be a long-term strategy, and China is one of the market leaders in green finance. The country's central bank has been playing a key role in establishing green finance pilot zones to foster China's sustainable growth. So is green finance the next frontier for international climate cooperation? What's going to be China's contribution? And worldly, what's the plan? Earlier on the sidelines of the China Development Forum 2021, I spoke to Augustin Carstens. He's the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements. Let's hear his views. As you may know, 2030, 2060, China has already set the goal for carbon zero and carbon neutrality. While climate change is a big issue, how will that, in a way, do you see, link China further with the rest of the world's economy?
Well, first of all, the signaling effect is very important. I think that the fact that China is committed to a greening of the economy and a greening in development is really remarkable, and it has to be highlighted.
But to you, the green finance has always been a big issue. And how well do you think that could be incorporated into the overall financial system of the world from your perspective?
Well, I think that we need to make our financial system evolve. We have already a few years of investment in trying to adapt our financial system to the goals of climate change, but more work needs to be done. We need to improve the infrastructure for markets to work. What is key is how do we evaluate, how climate-friendly different assets are. We have to come with taxonomy so that investors have a better guiding principles to design and to decide where are they going to put their money. And at the same time, we need to have a better perspective and deeper knowledge, better taxonomy again, to assess the financial stability risks that are involved in climate change.
Right.
So I think a lot of work needs to be done, but I think that we are on the right path, and we should be, the financial system should not be an obstacle for greening the economy.
But what kind of changes and especially danger, when you use the word, is there in the financial system when incorporating, the idea of green finance, how to do it well and safely, make sure it's a good transition? Have you ever been thinking about that? What are some of the concrete plans?
Well, if you want concreteness, let me give you one very concrete one. We here at the BIS help central banks in the managing of their international reserves. And therefore, we have opened already two bond funds, green bond funds, that basically facilitate for central banks to channel some of their international reserves. We have been working one in dollars. We just launched one in euros. And hopefully, in not much time in the future, we can come up one for Asia, and hopefully also at some point one in renminbi.
Interesting. Do you have a timetable already? Are you in discussion with anyone specific about this?
Yes, we have been having some preliminary ideas. Now, of course, this depends on the development of the bond market, green bond market in Asia and in China, to have better definitions, to have better ways to identify how green a bond is. And once this is ready, we are ready to launch it.
Interesting ideas. The other thing I want to ask you is really about, the issue of climate change. Of course, now we see China and the U.S. coming back to the Paris Agreement. There seems to be a much bigger momentum now, but the sustainability of the issue is still a question, because we see that's been changing with politics in certain countries. So, Agustin, how do you see that? Because the financial world needs to have stability all the time. That's the most important thing.
Well, my sense is that the sense of urgency, the sense of need of change is pretty much well rooted now. I mean, I think that the evidence of the impact of climate change is there. As we have more information, we can guess that we would be running huge risks if we don't take care of this issue. Not only from the point of view of growth, from the point of view of the well-being of the populations, which is the most important, but also financial stability risks. There are assets that might be stranded without much value if we don't recognize this, and therefore it's of the essence to move fast. So I would not be concerned about the fact that this is a fate. This is just a fashion that will go away next year. I mean, I think this is here to stay, and we rather start working hard and achieve the goals we have for the future.
How do you see the issue of so-called sovereignty vis-a-vis a global initiative, particularly in the financial world, if we talk about the green finance and some of the other things related to climate change?
Well, it's as in many different aspects. I mean, countries obviously need to respect they are guided primarily by sovereignty issues. Of course, each government responds to its people, but at the same time, we have to be mindful that in many aspects, in many economic phenomena, there are no borders, and climate change is one of them. I mean, we cannot artificially build a climate that is exclusive for one country, without interference from the rest of the world. Therefore, we need to recognize the interdependencies, and therefore we need to collaborate internationally. So as in many other different aspects, we need to reach the right balance between domestic interests and international objectives, which at the end are also part of the national interest.
Right. The other thing, of course, is about the stability of the international financial outlook. Agustin, you know better than I do about all the latest development, how economies are trying to revive their agenda in the near future, some by keep on printing money, as some being accused of. So how do you see all of this economic recovery measures, especially by a few countries, the impact of it on the future financial world?
Well, I mean, I think central banks in particular have been very skilled in responding to the pandemic. I think we wouldn't be here without the very strong measures that were taken last year. We still are not completely out of the woods. We still have some uncertainties as we move forward. And more than anything, we still don't see any negative signs of the measures themselves. What is important, and I think this is something we need to underline, is that it is very positive for the world economy that the two largest economies are in a path of very high growth. That is China and the U.S. As you know, an economy depends on internal forces, but also the external forces. And if the external environment is much better, I think that the external sector, basically being pulled by the U.S. and China, would help many economies to get out of the difficult times that have been imposed by the pandemic. I think it would help them. It would complement certainly the domestic efforts that different countries are doing to fight the pandemic.
What's going to happen to the developing world? I know you yourself personally also coming from a huge developing country. You know, the pandemic is going to have a huge impact on the economy, especially on the developing world. So how are we going to see them pick themselves up, in fact, amid all these uncertainties still?
I think what is very important is to put attention how resources should be reallocated in those countries. What I'm concerned about is about certain economies, for example, like economies that depend a lot on services and services related to face-to-face relationship, like tourism and so on. It's likely that those sectors will not come back as they were in the past. And therefore, these economies will have to look into alternative strategies for development. And not that tourism will disappear, but it might be that for some years, the dynamics there will not be as strong as they used to be. Therefore, countries will need to concentrate not only on having macro stability, but also have a development plan that allows them to develop different sectors and in such a way that they can provide employment to their population.
Great point. Let me move on, Mr. Carstens, to another point, which is about innovation in the financial world.
Well, my view is that innovation is here to stay, and I think we in the financial system need to have a clear view of how do we want to use technology to make for better financial systems in terms of resilience, in terms of reach, in terms of their impact on the economy. Financial inclusion is very, very important. Technology can help us to broaden the reach of financial services to the population at much better prices. It also should provide for better products so that we can provide a different type of transactions, but with safety. So I think that we obviously not everything is simple, not everything is straightforward. There are some issues that we need to take into account. Obviously, financial supervision and regulation is of the essence. Sometimes innovation runs much faster than what it should, and it exposes countries to different risks. But all in all, I think with a healthy interaction between the private and the public sector, we should make innovation work for us.
Augustin Carstens. You're watching World Insight. Coming up, China aims to be carbon neutral by the year 2060. How can multilateral institutions ensure that ambitious net zero goals can be fulfilled by countries rich and poor? Vice President of the BRICS New Development Bank, right after this.
You can't talk about green revolution to those people. It's about having food.
The clock is ticking on climate change. China last year announced a concrete target for climate change, which is to reach peak carbon emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. But countries should realize transitioning to a low-carbon economy will require mobilizing global partnerships. That's what world's multilateral institutions are dedicated to. On the sidelines of the 2021 China Development Forum, I talked to Leslie Masdorf, Vice President of the New Development Bank. In an exclusive interview, he outlined the multilateral solutions and plans put in place for steering the world towards a greener path. Take a look. It was quite an exciting weekend, isn't it? The China-U.S. Anchorage talk just wrapped up. A lot of drama, at least on TV screen. So what is your take of the conclusion?
I take a lot from the fact that there's been a recommitment by the United States under the President Biden administration to multilateralism, to re-engaging with the world. If you look at the recommitment to the Paris climate targets, if you look at the commitment towards carbon neutrality by 2060, something which China announced, there's a coincidence of interest in terms of the big picture global items. As we heard this morning from Henry Kissinger and from all of these luminaries who were involved in opening up dialogue in the early 70s, you have to look at the world through longer term lenses, right? So short term schisms, one should really look at that as sort of dramatic moments, if you like. But the long term trajectory is one of partnership, one of international collaboration, of looking for multilateral solutions to the problems facing the world today. I think one should sort of drill beneath the sort of headlines and look at what's underlying and there's a lot of forces of collaboration that is happening. So despite what you refer to as Alaska, there's huge collaboration on climate change and on sustainability between the United States and China, as there is between China and the European Union and the rest of the G20.
You know, the New Development Bank is an entity involving all the emerging economies, and they each have equal share and equal responsibility. But now, with the prevention and control of the pandemic and the economic recovery situations in various economies so different from one another, is there still a common destiny? Shall we describe it as that?
I would say that the idea of BRICS have been cemented now, right? The emerging markets, we are in one boat and we sing or we swim or sink together. So let's look at the New Development Bank. We have played a very critical role in enabling our economies to go through, to manage the health crisis, and now on the path to economic recovery. We put in place last year, March, a $10 billion economic recovery package under COVID response emergency loans. We provided $2 billion loans to each of the 5 BRICS countries. We are now in the final stages of completing a final loan of $1 billion to China to help with the economic recovery process. I guess what I'm saying is that the plight of these countries, of the emerging markets, we cannot solve our economic problems alone. It's all interconnected. The fiscal challenges that Brazil, that South Africa is facing today will not be resolved by those 2 countries alone. It will be resolved in this within this global context.
Climate change particularly now, many of the emerging economies are impacted by climate change, but now what is the way forward? What is going to be the financial approach, the financial way of encouraging measures against climate change?
The New Development Bank, together with all the other multilateral development banks, have put sustainability and climate finance at the center of our activities. I believe that 2021 is going to be a decisive year of change. As you know, we have the Glasgow COP26 in the UK happening later this year. And I think it is very likely that COP26 outcome is going to shift the financial sector globally into on a sustainable path. I mentioned earlier on the harmonization of standards that is happening. Between the central banks, they're also looking at how can we green the financial systems. The regulators are also discussing what regulatory measures they can put in place to ensure that there's a combination of both market initiatives and regulation, if you like, carrot and stick, in order to green the financial system. So the financial sector have a very critical role to play to make this carbon neutrality objective of 2050 and 2060 realizable. Because what it effectively means, this 2050 target, is that there's a commitment to only emit as much carbon as what you're removing from the atmosphere. In order to do that, industrial processes have to change. Business models of companies have to change. So there's almost like an industrial revolution that will be underway over the next couple of decades. And the role of the banking sector is to finance and to enable that. So I believe that over the next number of years, this will be the main work of multilateral banks. We will go out of traditional financing towards almost directing all of our activities towards sustainable finance.
Very interesting. About the streamlining of the standards, right, and different systems, how hard is it? Tell me more about it.
I think that, for the private sector, to invest more in infrastructure and to invest into the sustainable path, there needs to be very clear metrics, if you like. There needs to be very clear policy frameworks. You can't have multiple standards. Today, for example, you have, I think, close to 200 different environmental, social, and governance standards, because various countries, various stock exchanges, various regulators, they've all come up with standards. But now it's becoming too complex. It's becoming very difficult for an investor to know, if I invest in this project, what are the actual measures? How will that project contribute towards reducing carbon emissions, for example? So there are significant steps underway now within the financial services industry to synthesize these frameworks and to make it simpler, to fast-track the sustainability revolution.
And of course, the climate change issue, there's always different camps earlier, right? But there are still common interests of the emerging economies as to what green finance really means. What do you think the priorities are for the emerging economies?
I think for the emerging economies, as you know, there's been this tension between the developed world and the responsibilities of the developed world, given the fact that the developed world have been the ones leading the industrial revolution over the last few hundred years, which means that they've been the bigger emitters in the world. So there's always been a question about what, because now you are almost constraining the industrialization path of, let's say, continents like Africa, that has not really gone through that process of, big manufacturing and steel and aluminium and so on. But I think there's a recognition we are all in this together. There's only one planet. So the idea that now it is the chance now of developing countries to kind of go through that brown industrialization path, it is not possible. So I think emerging markets in the main, and all of our countries, the BRICS countries, have committed themselves to the Paris climate targets. And I believe at COP26 later this year, there'll be new, fresh commitments that countries will make.
Yeah, but there has to be some kinds of blueprint and roadmap by the emerging economies to bring into the overall plate, right, of policy considerations that would address the interests of the emerging economies. Exactly what are those points?
For example, many countries have, South Africa, where I'm from, is an example, Brazil is another, face a major problem of economic dislocation and unemployment as a result of COVID-19. We cannot, for example, set in motion green policies which lead to, let's say, further destruction of jobs. We have to make sure that the new economic growth path that is more green and sustainable in character is also focused on people and is also focused on the problems of inequality. So as we look at the green and sustainable agenda, in parallel, at the same time, we have to address the issues of inequality in emerging markets. Some countries are facing unemployment rates. In South Africa, for example, of over 32% of people are not gainfully employed. So you can't talk about green revolution to those people. It's about having food to eat. So it's important to combine these agendas.
And of course, that takes a strenuous effort.
Absolutely.
But starts from step one, at least.
Yeah, and as I said earlier on, we have to look at the world through longer-term lenses. We're going through a pandemic now. Once the vaccination, once we are able to inoculate our populations and economies are back onto a more sustainable long-term growth path, I think we will be able to look at the world in a much more integrated fashion again. At the moment, it's very much us and them almost.
Is the new development bank providing any support to your member countries on the vaccination?
Absolutely. So we have, as I mentioned, have put in place a $10 billion COVID response program. We are not directly financing the vaccination program, but the governments are able to direct resources towards vaccination because we have freed up other resources to support the public healthcare system, economic recovery loans, because it's the same pot of money, if you like. So we have played a significant role. We've provided $2 billion to China, to Russia, to India, to Brazil, $2 billion they didn't have before COVID.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.